O'Rourke is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of my special order.
Without objection, please finish.
Madam Speaker, with the President's recent announcement that through an executive action, he would commit resources and national attention and focus on building a wall with our neighbor to the south, Mexico, given some of the rhetoric that we have heard over the last year in the presidential campaigns about rapists and criminals coming from the country of Mexico, one might be confused at best or at worst believe that we have some kind of crisis on our border with Mexico, some kind of crisis in our relationship with our closest neighbor, a country that has done more to benefit the United States than any other country I can imagine, a country who is the #1 trading partner of the state of Texas, the 3rd largest trading partner of the United States, our partner on security, on economic development and growth, and on other important hemispheric issues. It's important today that we take this opportunity to ensure that our colleagues in the House have the facts, and it is with those facts that we can make better decisions, informed judgments, and the policy that's truly going to benefit not just the U.S.-Mexico border, not just border states like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, but the entire United States. Here are some facts that I'd like to start with, and then I want to ensure that some of my colleagues who can bring their wisdom and experience and perspective to this are able to do so. First fact that we should know is that we have record low levels of northbound migration from Mexico. In fact, more Mexican nationals today are going south into Mexico than are coming north into the United States. We have less than 0 migration from Mexico. Total northbound apprehensions of any people from any country coming across our southern border are also at historic lows. And if there are any surges in people or populations coming across that border, it happens to be young children and families fleeing horrific, historic violence in the Northern Triangle of Central America. And those little kids, they're not trying to evade detection. They're not trying to climb fences. They're not trying to escape the Border Patrol. They are, in fact, turning themselves in, presenting themselves to Border Patrol agents and to Customs and Border Protection officers at our ports of entry. We should also know that we are expending record amounts of U.S. taxpayer resources to secure the border. $19 billion a year this year, last year, and the years going forward, only to increase with these executive orders. We've more than doubled the size of the Border Patrol in these last 15 years, from just a little under 10,000 agents to over 20,000 agents on the U.S.-Mexico border and some on the U.S.-Canadian border. There has never been a terrorist organization, a terrorist plot, a terrorist act connected to our border with Mexico. There has been with our northern border with Canada. There has been connected to our international airports. There have been homegrown radical terrorists. There's never been a case of terrorism connected with our border with Mexico. But just in case, and we should remain vigilant, just in case, we've got those 20,000 Border Patrol agents. We've got thousands of Customs and Border Protection officers. We have 600 miles of fencing and physical obstructions already on our border with Mexico. We have aerostat blimps. We have drones flying overhead. We have a concentration of federal law enforcement, DEA, FBI, among others, including one of the largest military installations anywhere in the world, Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas, with 32,000 active duty service members. We have the security resources already that we need. I also think it's important to mention that El Paso, Texas, which is conjoined with Ciudad Juarez in Mexico and forms what I think is the largest true binational community in the world, certainly the largest on the U.S.-Mexico border. El Paso, Texas is not just the safest city on the U.S.-Mexico border. It's not just the safest city in the state of Texas. It is the safest city in the United States, and it's not an outlier. You look at other U.S. border cities like San Diego, California, you'll find that they are among the safest in the United States. In fact, there's a positive correlation with the number of migrants, immigrants, documented and otherwise, in a community and that community's relative safety. The U.S. side of the U.S.-Mexico border is far safer than the average American city deeper into the interior. These are some of the facts that we need to have at our command as we are developing policy, as we are judging the President's recent executive actions, and as we're thinking about how best to secure this country. Here's another fact that we need to keep in mind. If we are committing resources where they are not needed, where, for example, we don't have terrorism, where we don't have a problem with immigration, where we don't have an issue with security, then by definition, we're taking those resources from where they could be best used, where we have known risks and threats, where we have real problems against which we must contend, where we are not keeping Americans as safe as they could be because we're directing resources where they don't need to be. This is something that we need to know, I think, as we make policy for this country, as we fulfill our most important solemn obligation, which is the safety and security of this country and every American within it. Madam Speaker, I am very fortunate today to be joined by some outstanding colleagues. One whom I'd like to introduce from the great state of New York is a new colleague. He himself, an immigrant to this country. He represents tens of thousands of immigrants in his congressional district, has already from day one become a leader on this issue, introducing legislation that provides a more rational, humane, smarter approach to some of these issues that have been blown out of proportion, politicized, mythologized, and from that steering the country in the wrong direction. Here's somebody who wants to get us back on track. Madam Speaker, I would now like to yield to Representative Espaillat of New York.
Thank you for the gentleman from Texas, Madam Speaker. Back in 1987, then President Ronald Reagan issued one of his most famous speeches, "Tear down this wall," as he addressed then Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to insist that he open the barrier dividing West and East Berlin. It was perhaps one of the most exciting times as we watched to see if finally the Cold War would end. It was a moment of hope and strength and character that propelled our country to a higher regard and standard of our identity throughout the global community. Today, in stark contrast to that famous speech given by President Ronald Reagan, President Trump orders the construction of a $25 billion wall that divides communities, separates families, and perpetuates fear and hate, and sets a dangerous precedent and fails to elevate our country and confidence abroad the way it was back when President Reagan gave that famous speech. The economic ramifications will be devastating to the entire country, going as far north as New York City, because it's $25 billion that will be spent, or more, that will be spent on building this wall that could otherwise go to other meritorious projects. These executive actions also secure what I call insecure communities, not secure communities, a program that strains relationships between law enforcement and communities throughout the border and throughout that region of our country. We live in a global society and are connected with countries and citizens from around the world. To build this wall not only separates the United States from our bordering country, our neighbor, Mexico, which is one of our biggest trading partners, but the wall itself sends a strong message to citizens around the world that they are not welcome here in America. The President's wall and his anti-immigrant agenda is a continuation of the irrational and hateful rhetoric we have witnessed from him before, and stands contrary to who we are as American and to what we believe as a nation. I am proud to introduce one of my first bills in Congress called This Is Our Land, legislation that will prohibit this divisive wall from being erected in public lands. This is a time which we should be invested in our infrastructure, in roads, bridges, tunnels, airports, schools, housing, and respecting also our public lands. Building President Trump's wall would trample on our public lands, potentially put precious and dangerous species at risk, and likely disrupt or destroy environmentally important ecosystems and habitats. It would also deplete precious resources from our cities. We should be building a wall around Trump to stop these irrational executive orders instead of this ludicrous $25 billion wall between our closest ally. I yield back to Congressman O'Rourke.
I thank the gentleman from New York for his comments, again bringing his experience to bear, and right from the beginning introducing legislation, not just criticizing or complaining, but offering an alternative and reminding us that if we are to spend $20 billion, which is the upward cost of what President Trump's proposal would take from the American taxpayer, if we really want to spend that on building something in this country, there are roads, there are bridges, there are tunnels, there are legitimate infrastructure needs on which we could spend that money that would put people to work and would be money much better spent. Madam Speaker, I would now like to recognize my colleague from California, someone who represents a part of the border that really demonstrates what's beautiful about the United States-Mexico relationship in San Diego and Tijuana, a fierce advocate for our shared economic development and growth, the jobs that are connected to that, and everything that's beautiful about the U.S.-Mexico border. I yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters.
Thank you so much, Mr. O'Rourke, and thank you very much for putting together this time to talk about what's really a very important issue, and with all of the things going on, something that's even got a little bit lost. For the region I represent in San Diego, the border is an economic engine. It's a job creator. Home to the Otay Mesa, San Ysidro, and Tecate ports of entry, San Diego Baja is the busiest border crossing in the world. And from life sciences to electronics, San Diego is an attractive place to start a business and to manufacture goods, in part because of our proximity to border crossing and international trade. And last month, Mr. O'Rourke and other members of the Congressional Border Caucus and I held a hearing with local leaders from chambers of commerce from around our districts to discuss real pragmatic solutions and issues around the border. And I was joined by Jerry Sanders, who San Diegans well know as the former mayor. He was also the former police chief of San Diego and now the current president of the San Diego Regional Chamber of Commerce. And during that hearing, Mayor Sanders said that an efficient border is a safe border, and he knows something about safety from his time as a police chief. We also know that 99% of what gets screened at border crossings is safe, and there's no need to worry about it coming into the country. So what we need is to get more efficient at approving the 99% of safe cargo and travelers, and better at stopping the 1% that we don't want to come in. You know, one of the big challenges that we faced when I first came to Congress was border delays. We saw from the delays at the border crossing were costing us at that point $7.2 billion of economic activity in our county, 35,000 jobs annually. Numbers so big that they're almost unbelievable, but those numbers came from independent assessments. And one of the great successes I've had in Congress, working with my colleagues in our congressional delegation, was to work together to secure more than $500 million to finish the expansion and the improvements at the San Ysidro border crossing. And we did that working with Democrats Juan Vargas and Susan Davis, and with Republicans Duncan Hunter and Darrell Issa, is we all understood how important the border is, the United States-Mexico border is, to our regional economy. And by investing in infrastructure and innovation in San Diego, Tijuana, and across the border, we're keeping Americans safe and supporting the export of goods made in America by American workers. And in San Diego and other communities, we're embracing this forward-looking approach, this approach of opportunity and job creation. But now, President Trump wants to put us in reverse by building a wall, which we've assessed at $15 billion. I mean, I've heard estimates from $8 billion to $20 billion. By any count, it's a waste of money. Well, let's say for purposes of argument, it's $15 billion. It took Congress more than a year to approve $170 million to help Flint, Michigan recover from a crisis that has poisoned children and left an entire city without clean water. $170 million compared to $15 billion for a wall that nobody needs. Now we're talking about spending 100 times that money for Flint to build a wall that will do nothing to make us more secure, to make our children safer, to make us more prosperous. $15 billion is exactly how much the American Society of Civil Engineers says we will need to fill the funding gap for infrastructure needs at all of our nation's ports for the next decade. So if you took the money you're going to spend on this wall and you could cover all the investment we need in our ports around the country for the next decade, we're going to spend it on a wall. $15 billion is also 3 times as much money as the federal government spends to help the homeless every year. And for the cost of this wall, we could build the Navy the 11th aircraft carrier that it needs. For 60 times less, or 1/60th, we could finish the modernization of the Otay Mesa border crossing, which is the 3rd busiest commercial port of entry along our southern border and facilitates $35 billion in trade every year. What are we doing here, right? So unlike President Trump's wall, this investment will support long-term job creation and increase revenues and is a much more responsible way to spend Americans' taxpayer dollars. And let's be clear, American taxpayers are going to foot the bill for this wall, not Mexico. It's the leader of the Senate and Speaker Ryan who've come and committed they're going to spend $15 billion on this wall. That's American taxpayers. That's not Mexico. Instead of trying to turn his campaign rhetoric into policy, we would prefer that President Trump listen to those who understand what business is like at the border, who understand that border cities are safe, like El Paso, like San Diego, and that the border is an opportunity for America, not a threat. We don't need a wall. We need to hire more customs officers. We need newer screening technologies. We need to modernize and expand our infrastructure at other border crossings like we're already doing at San Ysidro. That's how you would create jobs in America. That's how you would keep us safe. I want to thank my friend Beto O'Rourke for his leadership and for hosting this conversation today. I look forward to working with you to divert this money from this silly proposal, this dangerous proposal, to the kinds of things and investments that our country needs from Texas to California. Thank you, Mr. O'Rourke. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from California for sharing his community's perspective and reminding us that when it comes to Mexico and our shared connection with Mexico, the U.S.-Mexico border, we have much more to look forward to than we do to fear. In fact, in the state of California, there are hundreds of thousands of jobs that depend on U.S.-Mexico trade. In the state of Texas, it's just under 500,000. In fact, every single state in the union, including Alaska, has tens, if not hundreds of thousands of jobs that depend on the flow of U.S.-Mexico trade that happens at our ports of entry and comes through at our border. 6 million jobs in this country, representing hundreds of millions of dollars in salaries and economic growth and add-on effects, are dependent on U.S.-Mexico trade. When we begin to prioritize our separation, sealing Mexico off from the United States literally, physically, we deprioritize those connections that make us stronger, that grow our economy, and create more jobs in the United States. One thing that we should know, as long as we're talking about sharing facts and confronting some of these unfortunate, untrue myths about the border, is that when we export to Mexico, of course we win. We're building things in our factories, we're sending them to Mexico, the Mexican consumer buys them, those dollars are flowing back to the U.S. worker. But it also happens that when we import from Mexico, we win. 40 cents of every dollar of value that we import from Mexico originated in the United States. So literally factory floor jobs in Ohio, in Iowa, in Michigan are producing things that go to Mexico that are part of final assembly that's re-imported to the United States. So we certainly make things in America today, but we make a lot of things in the United States and in Mexico concurrently. Our economies, our production platform, our future is inextricably connected. And to try to break that apart is not simply going to hurt Mexico. It's going to hurt the United States. It's going to hurt the U.S. worker. It's going to hurt our economy. It's going to hurt our opportunity at growth. So if we continue to cast Mexico as the enemy, if we threaten trade wars or pulling out of free trade agreements, if we construct a wall to try to humiliate that country at a time that it poses no security threat to the United States, the consequences are not going to be good. You may remember that I reminded you that migration from Mexico over the last 4 years is less than zero. More Mexicans going south than are coming north to the United States. If you build a wall, withdraw from our trade agreements, try to delink our economies, where you do not have a security or economic problem today, you will in the future have one. You will give people in Mexico a reason to flee that country and seek opportunity and jobs and connections and safety and shelter somewhere else. And that somewhere else, in many cases, is in fact going to be the United States. So if we want to make this country safer, if we want to make this country more prosperous, if we want to protect the American worker, then the policies that this president has adopted in the first 10 days in office are precisely the wrong way to go about doing it. They will make us less secure. They will slow down this country's economy. They will jeopardize the 6 million jobs that depend on U.S.-Mexico trade. So, if the U.S.-Mexico border is as secure as it has ever been, and look at any metric and you'll see that I'm right, if we're having record low levels of northbound migration and apprehensions, if we're spending record amounts, if we're using new technologies like drones to patrol the border, if we have 20,000 Border Patrol agents, which is also a record high, why is there so much concern? Why is there so much interest? Why is there so much anxiety? Why is there so much fear built up around the border? I'll tell you, this is a long time in coming. And when we say that there are real issues with where these border measures are coming from, let me give you an example of some of those. One of our colleagues, when describing young Mexican immigrants coming to this country, said, look at them. They have calves the size of cantaloupes. They're bringing drugs into this country. When you have a presidential candidate dismiss Mexican immigrants as rapists and criminals, despite the fact that immigrants commit crimes in this country at a much lower level than native-born U.S. citizens, when you have this kind of rhetoric, when you have this kind of mischaracterization, when you have this kind of vilification of an entire people and their connection to us at the U.S.-Mexico border, then you be the judge of where these priorities are coming from and what they are about and why they in no way reflect the real concerns and threats and issues that we have in this country today. My colleagues, the fact of the matter is, Mexico presents opportunity to the United States, and it always has. Whether it's the $90 billion in U.S.-Mexico trade that pass through just the ports of entry in El Paso, the city I have the honor of serving in Congress, and Ciudad Juarez, the city with which it is connected, whether it's the 6 million jobs that we already have in the United States economy, whether it is our security cooperation to ensure that we're disrupting transnational criminal organizations that are trying to move drugs and human chattel into this country, whether it is our work to address the real security issues in the Northern Triangle countries of Central America that border Mexico, we will lose a very valuable partner. We will lose those things that we want most: job growth, economic development, security for the people that we represent. When we begin to humiliate that country and its leadership, and President Peña Nieto has already canceled a trip to visit the United States in just 1 week of this administration, nothing good will follow that. We cannot wall Mexico off from the United States. We cannot wish them to disappear. They will always be there, and they should always be there, and we should be grateful that they will always be there, because they have always been a part of our history, our success, those things that are best about the United States, and God willing, they will always be part of our future. But I think it's going to take each and every one of us every Republican, every Democrat, every person who doesn't feel affiliation to a party, to stand together behind and with the facts, with the truth, with this country's best interests in mind. I am confident that if we do that, if we'll simply look at what's happening today, what's happened historically with that country, where our interests lie, we will make better policy. We will not be constructing walls between the two countries. We will at some point, hopefully sooner rather than later, tear down the 600 miles of fencing that already separates us. We will build more bridges that connect us, not just for trade, not just for economic growth, but for the reasons that the people I represent are so grateful for and proud of the place that they call home. A city that, with Ciudad Juarez, forms the largest binational community in the world, where last year alone, 32 million times people from El Paso and Juarez crossed into each other's cities. Our families are on both sides of the border. Our business partners are on both sides of the borders. Students at the University of Texas at El Paso who live in Ciudad Juarez and are Mexican nationals are granted in-state tuition because we want to attract the best and the brightest, the very best and the very brightest. And we're going to find them all over the world, in the United States certainly, but also in Mexico. I want to read to you a comment that a constituent of mine posted on our Facebook page this evening when I let my constituents know I'd be on the floor talking about the border, asking them to share the truth and the reality, their perspective versus the myth that we hear so often here in Congress, on national TV, and from those who don't live on or understand the border. Lisa Esparza said, "The border has been great because I grew up in Ciudad Juarez. I came to El Paso, paid for an education at a private school, learned English. I love the fact that I'm binational and I can think and speak in two languages." Lisa and millions of fronterizas and fronterizos, border residents, exemplify the best of this country, literally of what makes America great. And El Paso, for those of you who do not know, has for more than a century served as the Ellis Island for the Western Hemisphere. If you came up from Mexico, or your family did, or El Salvador, or Guatemala, or Honduras, or Costa Rica, or Argentina, there's a good chance that you came through the ports of entry in El Paso, Texas, that your family may have, before they went on to a destination further in the United States, settled in Segundo Barrio or in Chihuahuita. This is a community where they learned our laws, our values, where they learned to speak English, where they went to school, where they not just participated and believed in the American dream, but became net contributors to it. It's one of the reasons that El Paso, Texas is the safest city in the United States. It's the safest city, not in spite of the large number of immigrants who live in my community. And by official counts, 24% of the people that I represent were born in another country. It's not in spite of those people who were born in another country that El Paso is so safe. It is in large part because of their presence. Families who made extraordinarily difficult decisions to leave their home country, their home city, their families, the language they knew, the customs that they loved, to come to a new country. And they make sure that they follow our laws. They make sure that their kids follow our laws. They make sure that their kids are doing the right thing by this country so that they can get ahead, have an opportunity, and a crack at the American dream. Not only is there nothing wrong with that, there's something profoundly great about that. And it's what has helped make El Paso the safest city, a wonderful city in America, a great country. Someone else who understands the value of our relationship with Mexico, the special character of border people, and the value of immigration and immigrants is my colleague, Michelle Lujan Grisham of the state of New Mexico. I yield to the gentlewoman from New Mexico.
I thank my colleague for yielding time. Madam Speaker, the people who in fact know the border issues the best, whether it's companies or lawmakers, both Republicans and Democrats, border communities, trade groups, economists, and law enforcement officials, all agree that building a wall is unnecessary, impractical, ineffective, and it is a complete waste of time and taxpayer money. This wall, in fact, damages New Mexico's economy, and that's without taking into account President Trump's idea to now impose a 20% tax on Mexican imports to pay for it. When in the end, we know that if it's American jobs, American consumers, and American companies that will be hurt. Given that the United States already maintains approximately 650 miles of border fence, drone cameras, motion detectors, thermal imaging sensors, ground sensors, and 21,370 Border Patrol agents, the wall is completely unnecessary for the stakeholders who are in fact most impacted. The only person it truly benefits is President Trump by furthering his isolationist, divisive, and anti-immigrant agenda. I agree that this country should be building. And I agree with my colleague from El Paso that there is a wonderful thing, an incredible thing about building bridges and building highways and building buildings and refocusing our energy on making sure that everyone has a fair shot and that we're looking at those economic values and those economic indicators. But that's not what we're doing here. We're diverting our attention for an unnecessary, huge, colossal mistake that hurts the progress that border communities and border states have made. Madam Speaker, I yield back my time.
Does the gentlelady yield to
I yield
me?
right back to you, Mr. O'Rourke.
I'd like to thank the gentlelady from New Mexico for bringing her state's experience and perspective to bear on this issue, and for being a champion for the best in our traditions and our values. I'd like to build on the gentlelady's remarks and talk about one of the consequences of building walls. I've already made the case that the border is as secure as it's ever been. Those who study and understand security issues have come to the conclusion that extra miles of wall don't deter migrants. The lower levels of migration that we've seen to this country have a lot more to do with the U.S. economy and its struggling performance in the immediate aftermath of the Great Recession and throughout that road to recovery, and relatively speaking, the performance in other countries, including Mexico, that has afforded Mexican nationals more opportunity to stay there. So now the border is as secure as it's ever been. We recently doubled the size of the Border Patrol. We're using the latest and greatest technology to remain as vigilant as possible, which we should. And it's also important to know the character and quality of the Border Patrol agents and Customs and Border Protection officers who man the line, who are at our ports, and who have one of the most difficult, dangerous jobs that anyone has in the federal government. The conditions in which they work, the situations which they must anticipate, the constant vigilance that they must maintain, and the kind of threats that they have to be aware of, which include drug smuggling, which is critically important to stop, which include human smuggling, which we must deter and stop, and which includes, even though there's never been a terrorist or a terrorist act connected to the U.S.-Mexico border, includes the possibility that sometime that might happen. And those men and women are literally on the front line protecting this community. I'd like to see some of those $14 to $20 billion proposed for the construction of a wall put behind our Border Patrol agents to improve their salaries, their working conditions, the ability for them to do their job and to keep us safe. I'd like to hire more Customs and Border Protection officers, the men and women in blue at our ports of entry who facilitate legitimate trade and travel at our ports of entry. They're the ones who help to keep this economy humming while keeping us safe. Madam Speaker, one of the consequences, though, of building walls, while it doesn't make us safer and while it uses a lot of resources that could be better put towards other more legitimate security challenges, it does do one thing that I want all of us to know about. It does ensure that migrants coming to this country will unnecessarily suffer and many will die. In the same time where we have gone from 1.6 million apprehensions a year. That was the year 2000, 1.6 million apprehensions on our southern border, to last year when there were just a little over 400,000. So a quarter of the level that we had 15, 16 years ago. In that same time that we've had record low levels of migration, we have maintained record high levels of migrant deaths. So those few migrants who do try to cross in between our ports of entry and do encounter physical barriers are going to more remote sections of the border. They're dying of thirst, they're dying of exposure. These are otherwise preventable deaths. And so I ask you to think about it this way. Whether you're looking at the moral dimension of this, the otherwise preventable deaths, the effort to humiliate our closest partner in the country of Mexico, whether you look at the economic dimension of this, if you want to protect those 6 million jobs that depend on a strong U.S.-Mexico connection, whether you look at the security dimension and taking our eye off the ball when it comes to real threats, proven threats that we have in this country, at our international airports, at our northern border with Canada, or increasingly homegrown radicals in the United States, radicalized over the internet. If you want to remove resources from those real threats, then go ahead and build a wall if it makes you feel good. But it's going to make us less safe, it's going to make us less economically secure, and it's going to be to our lasting shame. It will haunt us, and it will haunt us for generations, for anyone who supports this or does not stand up and speak against it. I would like to leave you with two anecdotes that I think exemplify the beauty, the strength, and the safety of the border. The first is a story that of an event that took place this weekend in El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, where we are joined by the Rio Grande River Channel. And right now, all that water is stored up at the Elephant Butte Reservoir in New Mexico, and really there's just a little trickle in the river channel, not more than a couple of inches deep. And thanks to the Border Network for Human Rights, and thanks to the Border Patrol who allowed this, they were able to organize 300 families from Mexico and El Paso who were allowed to meet one family at a time in the middle of that river channel, both sides clearly identified, so there would not be any security or immigration issues. And those families got to spend a total of 3 minutes together. Families who in some cases had not seen each other for decades. A young woman posted on Facebook that she drove down from Oklahoma City to see her dad, who she had not seen in 10 years. You had folks meeting grandchildren they had never seen before, sons or daughters-in-law that they had never seen before, weeping, crying, laughing, hugging, holding, kissing for 3 minutes. That to me is absolutely beautiful. That to me is family values. That to me shows you the extent to which people will try to be together, to be with each other, to do the things that perhaps you and I as U.S. citizens take for granted. And that happened in El Paso, Texas, thanks to the Border Network for Human Rights, thanks also to the men and women in the Border Patrol. Didn't compromise our security, didn't add any new immigrants to this country. It was just doing our best under the current conditions. The other anecdote that I would like to share with you, and which I will close on, involves another outstanding organization in the community that I have the honor to serve, Annunciation House, led by Ruben Garcia, who, when we faced unprecedented numbers of young children and young families, young moms in their teens and 20s, coming up from Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador, which had become the deadliest countries, not just in Central America, not just in the Western Hemisphere, but in the world, the deadliest countries in the world. Kids being murdered and raped and sold into slavery, those kids fleeing that horrific brutality and violence, coming up the length of Mexico, sometimes riding on top of a train known as La Bestia or the Beast, to come and present themselves at our border. Not evade detection, not try to escape, not try to do anything against the law, literally as the law prescribes, presenting themselves at our ports of entry to a Border Patrol agent or a Customs and Border Protection officer and asking for help and for shelter, depending on the best traditions inscribed on the Statue of Liberty, counting on the United States in their moment of need. Well, the Border Patrol were outstanding. The agents themselves, out of their own pockets often, were buying toys and gifts for these young children, taking care of them, having their hearts broken, doing their best to serve them. agents who work for ICE and immigration were doing their best as well. And as that flow of people, the number of people became too many temporarily for us to hold and to process, they got in touch with Ruben Garcia at Annunciation House, which is a charity operated in El Paso, Texas. And Ruben took those asylum seekers, those refugees, and housed them, clothed them, fed them, ensured they had showers and medication and a visit with a doctor, the ability to talk to their families deeper in the interior of the United States, and most importantly, especially for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, had a full and complete understanding of their legal obligations under U.S. law, what they were allowed and not allowed to do, what their court expectations were, and that they must appear in court, and that their issue must be adjudicated, and that they may or may not be able to stay in this country. And Annunciation House, Ruben Garcia, the volunteers who work for him, and hundreds of other El Pasans who contributed, did this at not a penny's cost to the federal taxpayer or to our government. So $20 billion to build a wall, or Annunciation House taking care of refugees, asylum seekers, little kids who need our help for free. That's the border. That's the best of us. That's the best of this country. That's what we need to think about. Those are the folks we need to listen to. Those are the facts we need to understand before we even contemplate building a wall, separating ourselves from Mexico, giving in to the nativist sentiment and instinct that was so proudly on display during this presidential election. I think if we look at the facts, if we take the best from the border, we're going to get the best policy and the best outcome from the United States. And after all, isn't that why we were all sent here? Isn't that what we're supposed to do when our voters sent us here to do the work of the American people? With that, Madam Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2017, the gentleman